Today, there are more than 8 billion humans on Earth. But according to a recent genetic study, there may have been a moment in our past when the entire human population dropped to just about 1,280 adults. That is a number small enough for every single human alive to fit inside of one large school building, or just a small section of a sports stadium. If that happened today, Homo sapiens would instantly become one of the most endangered species on Earth. And yet scientists now think something very close to this may actually have happened 930,000 years ago. Hidden inside our DNA is evidence that our ancestors passed through a catastrophic population crash that wiped out about 99% of humans alive at that time. For a species that now dominates the planet, builds cities, and even maintains a permanent presence in space, the idea that humanity once came within a hair's breadth of extinction is almost impossible to imagine. But is it true? We first reported on this controversial discovery back in 2023. Since then, scientists have been debating what it really means. In this video, we'll dig into the genetic clues that suggest that humans nearly vanished and explore what kind of catastrophe could have pushed humans to the brink. Because the deeper scientists look into our past, the more unsettling the picture becomes. Our species dominates the planet today, but nearly 1 million years ago, the entire future of humans may have rested on the survival of just a few hundred families. Which raises an even bigger question. Because if humanity came this close to extinction once, how many other times has it happened? And what's to stop it from happening again? Chapter 1. The disaster hidden in our DNA. Our species is incredibly successful. You don't get to 8 billion people without doing something right. We're culturally diverse too. Just look at all of the different societies across the world, all the different customs, cuisine, literature, architecture. This amazing variety is what makes the world such an exciting and interesting place. But hidden in our DNA is a secret. We now have the technology to quickly and cheaply analyze DNA. In fact, millions of people have now had their DNA read to some extent. And as scientists have begun to compare the genomes from people all across the world, they've discovered something unexpected. We are nowhere near as diverse at the genetic level as you would think. Let me explain that. Imagine today picking someone at random from Tokyo and somebody at random from Rio de Janeiro, and then comparing their DNA. An amazing 99.9% of the DNA will be identical. But if we look at our great ape relatives, that is not the case. There are probably no more than 300,000 chimpanzees left in the wild, and they are confined to Africa. Now, with such a small population, you would think that chimpanzees would be more or less identical at the genetic level. Only they aren't. In fact, their DNA is far more diverse than ours is. That means that 2 chimpanzees, both living in Central Africa, on opposite sides of a river, might be more genetically distinct from each other than 2 humans living on opposite sides of the planet.
Today's people have about the same genetic diversity in that sense as bonobos do. And bonobos live in a very small part of sort of the DRC. Humans and our ancestors have lived across almost all of Africa and much of Eurasia. So this is a mismatch. We can look at our comparisons with other ancient humans, including Neanderthals, Denisovans, and we could say, well, if you pool all of us, we still have kind of low variation compared to many other kinds of mammals. Some of our low variation comes from the connections between people. All the populations of Europe, of East Asia, of Australia, of the Americas, all of those people have shared events that suggest that they came from a very small group, a few thousands of people.
And that raises an obvious question. Why? To answer that question, we have to talk about something called bottlenecks. We're all familiar with traffic bottlenecks, right? So narrow pinch points that are difficult to pass through. Nobody likes bottlenecks. They slow down traffic, and that means delays upon delays upon delays. But we do ultimately get to our destination. But genetic bottlenecks are a little bit different. There are still narrow pinch points, but crucially, only a few individuals make it through the bottleneck. The rest, well, they die trying.
When we talk about bottlenecks, what we're saying is that looking at people that we have to sample, their ancestors were a smaller number than we think that they should be. When we look at the variation in the world today, it looks like it came from a population that was tens of thousands of people, and not millions of people, not hundreds of thousands of people. So that seems like a mismatch.
So let's go back to that traffic bottleneck for a second. Imagine there are 1,000 vehicles trying to squeeze through. There are lots of variations in those vehicles. There are some red cars, some blue, silver, even some yellow ones. And there are some sports cars, SUVs, some large trucks, lorries too. Now imagine, only 10 of those vehicles ever make it through that bottleneck. The rest are forever trapped on the wrong side. You're not going to have that much variety left, are you? Of those lucky 10 vehicles that make it through, maybe 4 are silver SUVs, maybe there are 3 black cars, a couple of red ones, and a blue one. No trucks, no sports cars, no yellow cars. And that is what a genetic bottleneck is like. It strips out a lot of the variety in the original population. The survivors might go on to flourish, and the population might grow to a vast size, to billions of individuals, but the memory of the bottleneck is still there in the DNA. All of those individuals will have pretty similar DNA because they all came from that small population of survivors that made it through the bottleneck. So because living people are so similar at the genetic level, we know our ancestors must have passed through at least one of these genetic bottlenecks in the past. And a few years ago, almost by accident, an international team discovered one of them, a big one. This team, led by Haipeng Li at the Chinese Academy of Sciences, weren't actually looking for bottlenecks. They just wanted to estimate ancient population sizes, which they could do by analyzing the DNA from a large number of living people, about 3,000 in this case. But when the results of their analysis came in, they revealed that our ancestors experienced a massive drop in their population size about 930,000 years ago. Something big must have happened to wipe out so many people, leaving just 1% to continue that lineage that would eventually lead to us. But what? Chapter 2. What could have wiped us out? Even 930,000 years ago, humans were smart. They had the brains and the technology they needed to cope with a lot of challenges. So what on earth could have wiped out 99% of them?
If something bad happened, we want to know what it was, right? What happened to make the population small?
Now, maybe you're thinking it must have been a big environmental disaster, right? And in theory, it could have been. For instance, much more recently, about 74,000 years ago, there was an enormous volcanic eruption in Indonesia. And some people have suggested that this eruption, it's called the Toba eruption, by the way, was so extreme that it sent so much ash into the atmosphere that what followed was a year-long volcanic winter and a collapse in the human populations around at the time. In other words, a volcanically triggered genetic bottleneck. The thing is, these days, the Toba eruption bottleneck idea is more controversial among scientists. And in any case, going back to our bottleneck at 930,000 years ago, we don't know about any major volcanic eruption at that time.
There was no giant meteorite that happened a million years ago, right? There was no asteroid, there was no comet. There was no giant volcano that made a big difference to the human population at that time. And to the extent that we see giant volcanoes in the last 2 million years, they don't really seem, we don't see population effects that have this kind of genetic effect.
But what we do know is that the climate was changing. Back then, the problem wasn't rising temperatures, it wasn't global warming. Instead, it was global cooling. There were some big ice sheets at high latitudes up near the poles. Now, at that time, our ancestors were really confined to lower latitudes in Africa and perhaps also in Asia. But they wouldn't have escaped the effects of the glaciation.
A lot of people get interested in climate, right? Maybe the initiation of the glaciations caused this huge problem.
That's because glaciations have global consequences. As temperatures dropped, seawater cooled. Now, cooler water is less likely to evaporate, so the atmosphere above the seas and oceans would have become drier, and the winds would have helped spread that drier air across the world. Drier air means less rain, and less rain means drought. In fact, the scientists think there might have been widespread and long-lasting drought at this time, with some deserts expanding. Not only that, but there is some evidence from the fossil record of a wildlife turnover. That's an event where plenty of wild species on the landscape become rare or even vanish altogether. Now, by this point in prehistory, our ancestors had spent 1 million years or more living in Africa. They had learnt to make impressive stone tools, hand axes, that are sometimes compared to Swiss Army knives because they are so versatile. They had learnt to hunt big game, even ancient relatives of today's elephants. But for most of that time, our ancestors had lived in a lush green landscape. Severe droughts might have been rare and short-lived, challenging to deal with for sure, but not necessarily a survival threat. But what if the world's climate suddenly flipped? Instead of severe droughts being rare, they became very common. Maybe the ground was parched for years on end, vegetation withered and died. Grazing animals starved. Finding food was suddenly a much bigger challenge. To put it another way, the world was in flux, and our ancestors began to find that survival strategies that had worked for generations were no longer effective. Hunts failed, people starved, populations shrank. Humans came within a hair's breadth of extinction. But hold on, just one moment. Before we get too carried away, I should say that some other scientists, not surprisingly, aren't that convinced that conditions became tough enough to trigger a global population crash.
We have major climate effects throughout the Pleistocene that don't correspond with anything that's really tangible in terms of genetics. That tells us that, well, okay, if there was some sort of climate shift, it's exceptional on a scale that we don't see later. And we just don't see signs of that scale of shift.
And they have good reason to be skeptical, because there is actually another side to this story that we haven't explored yet. And when we do, the narrative begins to look very different.
If you ask me, what is the most likely, right? What's actually going to explain this? I would say that it's probably, we're not seeing a crash, right? The evidence for a bottleneck is never that we see a crash.
Chapter 3, the extinction event that never was. If you're as fascinated as we are by the story of human evolution, then you'll probably enjoy exploring some of those mysteries a little further. Because the deeper scientists look into our past, the more complicated the story becomes. New fossils, genetic discoveries, and ancient clues are constantly forcing researchers to rethink how our species emerged. One of our recent podcast episodes explores a remarkable skull discovered in China, and it could challenge one of the most widely accepted ideas about human origins, potentially pushing parts of our evolutionary story back hundreds of thousands of years, raising new questions about who we are. You can find the conversation on our New Scientist podcast channel, The World, the Universe, and Us. Our award-winning weekly show is hosted by Dr. Penny Sarche and Dr. Rowan Hooper. Each week, they unpack the biggest developments in science, from mathematical mysteries and human evolution to the frontiers of physics and the future of our planet, bringing in expert guests to explain what the latest discoveries really mean. Remember, the podcast now has its own dedicated channel. Click the link in the description to subscribe and make sure you don't miss an episode. The DNA inside our bodies is a surprisingly powerful tool for investigating our prehistoric past. But it is not the only tool on offer. Another way is to examine the fossils that we dig up. There are thousands of archaeological sites across the world, preserving the artifacts and skeletal remains of people now long gone. Now, logically, if humanity experienced a massive population crash about 930,000 years ago, one that wiped out 99% of people, well, surely we should see that in the archaeology. We're not talking here about mass graves, but we would expect a dramatic decline in the number of archaeological sites recording human activity. And we don't really see that. There are actually plenty of archaeological sites across Africa, Asia, and Europe that were occupied by humans 930,000 years ago. And they were still occupied after that time, even though the DNA tells us that by then our ancestors could comfortably be squeezed into a large gymnasium. So something here doesn't quite add up. The DNA is clearly showing us that our ancestors experienced a massive population crash, and the archaeology is revealing that there probably were plenty of humans around even after this supposed crash. And I know what you're thinking, they surely can't both be right. Either the DNA is wrong or the archaeology is wrong.
Some reconstructions of what happened suggest that, well, there was a bottleneck. There was a time that ancient humans arose and that ancient human group grew enough, and the Neanderthals and Denisovans went their own way, and the African populations became more diverse at that time. This was a beginning in some way of maybe our lineage. Other folks will look at that and say, what we can see is that this was a smaller, less diverse population at that time, but was it really tiny, right? Was there some catastrophic, really crash? So that seems like a mismatch. It's a mismatch in particular relative to the fossil and archaeological records, because we know that we have tools that were made by hominins, people that were across large parts of Africa, large parts of Eurasia across this time. So that's the basic principle of bottleneck. There's a mismatch.
But here's the surprising truth. The DNA and the archaeology might both be right. Here's how. If we wind the clock back to 930,000 years ago, there were quite a few different human species on the planet. We're talking Homo erectus, for example, an ancient species that actually evolved around 2 million years ago, and we know that there were others as well. But today, all that variety has vanished. Homo sapiens, we, are the last human standing. So when we look at the DNA of living people, we're really only getting an insight into what our direct ancestors were doing 930,000 years ago. Our DNA can tell us very little about the fortunes of all of those other species that also existed 930,000 years ago, because those other humans aren't our direct ancestors. Or most of them aren't anyway. These days, we do know that there was some mixing and interbreeding between these species, but we don't know how much. What that means is that the DNA could be correct. Our ancestors experienced a 99% population crash. And the archaeology could also be correct. Humans in general, all those other species that never made it to the present, in the broader sense, were still surviving and thriving back then.
A lot of things are possible. And that's exciting because it means that we have, different ways to align the genetic evidence with the fossil record. But it's frustrating because until we have another ancient genome that gives us more leverage on this, I expect that we're not going to settle it.
And there's one more take on this 99% population crash. It's becoming clearer that these ancient humans were split into a number of distinct populations that didn't mix much. Now, what if one of those distinct populations at around 930,000 years ago saw, let's say, 1,280 adults split away from that bigger population and set off on their own? And what if, just by chance, that small population ended up having a big influence over the modern gene pool? In that scenario, our modern DNA would carry a signature of this event 930,000 years ago, when our ancestors numbered just 1,280. But that tiny population isn't evidence of a disaster that wiped out 99% of humans. In fact, those 99% of humans might have continued to do just fine. It's just that they no longer mixed with that tiny population, that 1% of humans, those 1,280 individuals who contributed most DNA to humans today. It's the extinction event that never was.
The evidence is always that we see an expansion. And we cannot answer whether the expansion happened in the context of extinction or if the expansion happened in the context of some small number of groups really succeeding. And the rest of them just didn't succeed as much. But what happened was that some groups just really worked. They really expanded. And what we see in the end is the signs of their success and not the direct evidence of failure of everybody else.
Right now, we actually don't have enough evidence to judge whether that scenario might have played out, but we do know that some other genetic bottlenecks in our past can be explained by this sort of population split. Probably the most famous of these occurred 60,000 years ago. By then, our species, Homo sapiens, had appeared. We were present across Africa and had a foothold elsewhere. However, elsewhere outside of Africa, we would go extinct. Then, about 60,000 years ago, one small population of our species left Africa successfully. And these guys, they were incredibly successful. In fact, pretty much all living people with ancestors from Europe, Asia, the Americas, Australia, anywhere outside of Africa, basically can trace their origins to this small population. How small was that population? It's been estimated that it could be as small as 10,000 people. If that's correct, that's larger than the population 930,000 years ago. Remember, that one has been estimated at around 1,500 people. But 10,000 people is still a tiny number.
All of the people outside of Africa in recent historic time, all the populations of Europe, of East Asia, of Australia, of the Americas, all of those people have shared events that suggest that they came from a very small group, a few thousands of people at a time around 50,000 years ago. In Africa, it's different. African populations today retain more variation from that period of time. Their populations were not restricted to a small number of ancestors. That event, what we today term the out of Africa event, was a major transition in the histories of peoples of Eurasia.
And here's the thing, this example shows you how important context is. Because if I told you that all these non-African populations passed through this severe bottleneck just 60,000 years ago, you might well think, whoa, something absolutely disastrous must have happened to reduce the ancestral population to just 10,000 people. But if I told you, no, what you're really seeing here is not an ancient disaster, but the moment that a small group of pioneers strode out of Africa to explore the world, well, it puts a completely different spin on things. And more importantly, it fits with the story we like to tell about ourselves as a species, that we're curious, we're clever, we have this burning desire to stride out and explore. It's actually quite a romantic image. It's very powerful. And there's really very little room there for this idea of a catastrophe and disaster, because the human story is a successful one. So when we learn there was a mysterious genetic bottleneck about 930,000 years ago, and we're not sure why, what are we going to decide is the most likely explanation? It just feels more likely that the bottleneck is another of these pioneering moments when a few hundred humans decide to stride out on their own and try something new. Because the alternative, that this was a moment when humans nearly failed, it does feel almost unthinkable.
I'll tell you, everybody wants a Garden of Eden. right? Everybody wants a Noah's Ark. Everybody wants this story that we, against all odds, we came from some very tiny number and we succeeded and we survived.
Except that there's one final strand of evidence we still need to explore. Because in the past few years, we have actually discovered something quite unsettling about our species. It turns out that the unthinkable can and does happen. Humans have not only come close to failure, they actually have failed repeatedly. Chapter 4, the surprising truth about human survival. Homo sapiens were not the first species in Europe. In fact, there have been many humans there for about 1 million years. But those earlier humans belonged to ancient species, groups like the Neanderthals. Modern humans had entered Europe numerous times. However, they didn't establish a permanent foothold until about 54,000 years ago. Now, our species is perhaps the most successful and sophisticated human species of them all, particularly when you consider that our species now numbers in the billions and all of those other ancient human species are long gone. So it does make sense to us that those pioneering Homo sapiens who first reached Europe thrived, that they gradually took over the continent and squeezed out all of those ancient Neanderthals. But that is not actually the full story. In fact, those very first populations of our species in Europe did not thrive. They were really struggling. What went wrong? We don't really know. These first populations, they were clearly sophisticated people. They spread across the continent, from Poland in the east to the British Isles in the west. They hunted reindeer and woolly rhinos using beautiful stone tools to butcher their carcasses. But then they disappeared. We know this because geneticists have managed to extract DNA from the ancient skeletons of people who belonged to these first populations. And there is no trace of their DNA in today's Europeans. This wasn't a genetic bottleneck that took out 99% of the population. It took out the full 100%. It looks like no one survived. It was only when our species returned to Europe that they managed to thrive and establish a permanent presence. So essentially, you're looking at a case of the most successful species of human that ever existed, entering into Europe numerous times, not making it, and then only eventually gaining a foothold.
Every piece of evidence that we have from ancient genetics today tells us that against all odds, people made it work with other populations that were really different from them, right? When you say that I'm 2% Neanderthal, what that means is that there were groups of people that were separated for 800,000 years from each other that in the end came back together and found a way to make it work.
Stories like this, stories of our species trying but ultimately failing to survive in a new landscape, well, we're beginning to suspect that they're actually quite common in prehistory. Here's another possible example. One of the biggest questions in archaeology is about the arrival of our species in the America. Many archaeologists think that humans reached the landmass when Earth's climate was colder, when lots of water was frozen into massive ice sheets in the northern hemisphere. Because those ice sheets were so large and contained so much water that sea levels were much lower. It was actually possible as a result to walk from Siberia to Alaska because the Bering Sea that now separates the two didn't exist at that time in that way. So there's broad agreement on how humans reached the America via the Bering Strait, but is there agreement on when they did so? Not so much.
Were people in the Americas 18,000 years ago? Were people in the Americas 20,000 years ago? Were people in the Americas only in the last 14,000 years, right? Genetics doesn't answer that question clearly.
Previously, evidence suggested that humans have been living in the Americas for about 15,000 years. But did humans reach there earlier? New evidence is suggesting that that is actually the case. Probably the most dramatic evidence comes from thousands of ancient human footprints preserved in New Mexico. A few dozen of them seem to be really old. We're talking maybe 23,000 years old. Now, there is some DNA evidence that suggests that the first Americans entered into that landmass sometime after 20,000 years, which isn't really compatible with footprints that are 23,000 years old. But if those footprints were left by humans who were there earlier, perhaps they didn't survive to pass on their DNA to modern populations, then archaeology and genetics could actually both be correct. Perhaps they were another group that hit tough times. Perhaps they came up against 100% population replacement.
Is there an earlier movement that somehow got covered up, which is very possible? And there's some suggestion of this in South America now. Or is this, sort of a slower motion expansion, and that's what its signature looks like, is what we see today? I think it's going to be great.
Chapter 5. Survival was never guaranteed. Why do we care about the deep past at all? Well, I think one reason is that we love stories. And we particularly love stories about ourselves, stories that help us make sense of the world and our place in it. And there's no better way to understand our place in the world than by investigating the deep history of our species and uncovering the clues that help explain why we came to dominate our planet. Now, a really good story should be full of unexpected surprises, right? And that's why our starting point here was so compelling. It's almost unthinkable to imagine our ancestors struggling to survive. So the idea that 99.9% of them vanished, it's not what we expect to hear, not something many of us have really contemplated. So it makes us sit up and take notice. We want to know more, and then we dig deeper. And we find that there are ways to explain that 99% figure that don't necessarily involve major disasters or the near extinction of all humans. And I think we find that reassuring. And for a lot of us, that's probably where we would like the story to end. But science doesn't always meet our expectations, because we know that there's an epilogue to our story, and it's a really unsettling one. Our survival was never guaranteed. It's comforting to imagine that our species moved from success to success on its route to world domination. But we're now beginning to realize that the story was much more complicated, that it involved plenty of hardship and wiped out whole populations.
Everybody likes a story about a pioneer, surviving against the odds. Every day, people in the world are surviving against the odds, right? And those of us who are not fighting against the odds at any given minute should feel fortunate. When I look at past people and their skeletal records, and I understand the real challenges that they persisted through, they survived through, I say, wow, that is something that is intrinsically us, is that we find ways to make it work even when everything seems to be broken. And I think that that's a shared message that all of us can take away.
Our species dominates the world today. But if our survival wasn't inevitable, then the real question is this: who were the other humans that almost inherited the Earth instead? Click on our next video to find out.